Tonight's speaker is Roger Ream, the president of the Fund for American Studies. For those of you who don't know, the Fund for American Studies does work that is a great complement to our own here at the Martin Center. While we work on improving colleges and universities through public policy change, the Fund for American Studies works directly with students and young professionals. The mission of TFAS is to change the world by developing leaders for a free society. The organization offers programs to teach the principles of limited government, free market economics, and honorable leadership to students and young professionals in America and around the world. Roger's road to his current role was a long one. His first encounter with the Fund for American Studies was in 1976, when he attended one of the organization's summer institutes as a student. He didn't come to work for the organization until 1991, after spending 15 years working in politics and public policy. And then he became the president of the Fund for American Studies in 1998. During Roger's tenure, TFAS has expanded its programs internationally to 3 continents and has more than doubled the number of institutes in Washington, D.C. In 2013, TFAS added the Robert Novak Journalism Fellowship Program and formed a strategic partnership with the Foundation for Teaching Economics. Roger now also serves as the president of FTE. In addition to his work with TFAS, Roger is chairman of the board of the Foundation for Economic Education, and serves on the boards of Donors Capital Fund, the U.S. Air Force Academy Foundation, and America's Future Foundation. He is a founding member and secretary of the Frank S. Meyer Society, past president of the Philadelphia Society, and member of the Mont Pelerin Society. And in between that, he found the time to come and talk to us tonight, for which I'm very, very grateful. Roger traces his passion for ideas of freedom and free markets to his father, a minister who stressed the moral underpinnings of individual liberty and the connections between freedom and human flourishing. And I find that something that I can agree with, and I think all of you can agree with as well. So please join me in welcoming Roger Ream.
Well, thank you. Good evening, everyone. It's really wonderful to be in Raleigh tonight with friends and supporters of the James Martin Center for Academic Renewal. I've been a follower of the James Martin Center for years, including when it operated under a previously equally distinguished name. I had the opportunity, as Jenna mentioned, early in my career to get involved a little bit in politics and public policy. I worked as an intern on Capitol Hill while in college and came back for several years to work for a congressman who worked closely with then Congressman Jim Martin. I worked for Phil Crane from Illinois, and I think, at least on one occasion, I may have come down to North Carolina with Phil to campaign for you, and you were struck me as a young 21 or 22-year-old as right on the central casting of the kind of Mr. Smith goes to Washington and really is there for a purpose. He thinks elections are a means to an end and not the end in themselves. So I know I'm honored to be here with you, Governor Martin, and honored to be before an organization that has your name on it. The work of the center is vital, especially given the current state of higher education in our country. Speaking before such a distinguished group as the Martin Center, following Robert Shipley and others who've spoken before you is quite a challenge. Speaking to an organization that has such great people as Jenna Robinson and Jade Shallon and my longtime friend George Leath is somewhat intimidating. I'm reminded of a story I heard recently about Bob Musick, the formidable New York Yankees third baseman in the 1920s who followed Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig in the lineup and is now thus largely forgotten. Considering the contributions of the Martin Center on the topic of higher education and these other distinguished speakers you've heard from, I'm sure you'll consider me minor league. But it's an honor to be here and to be with an organization on the front lines of the battle for education reform. Speaking of battles, we are in the midst of one right now. What we see taking place in higher education is part of a larger battle for the soul of America and the soul of the rising generation of young people. Nearly 30 years ago, those of us who call ourselves classical liberals, believers in limited government and free enterprise, thought we had won the battle of ideas. In 1992, Francis Fukuyama declared the end of history. The battle was won. Democracy and capitalism were transcended and not to be challenged. Communism and its system of economic organization, socialism, were destined, in the words of Ronald Reagan, for the ash heap of human history. But as Thomas Jefferson warned us several centuries earlier, the natural progress of things is for government to gain ground and liberty to yield, which is why we have to be ever vigilant and the end of history never comes. The desire for power, I suppose, and the perks that come with it are so overwhelming that a clash of competing ideas will always be with us, both in the global arena and here in the United States. And that is why our educational systems, K through 12 and higher education, are so vital to the future of a free republic. We must make sure that the values we hold and the knowledge of our history are passed along to each generation, because this is an experiment in liberty. The outcome is never finally determined. It's an ongoing experiment that requires each generation to determine whether it will continue successfully. And the rising generation can't do that unless we do our job in maintaining the institutions of higher education, K through 12, our churches and our communities, in such a way that the values we hold dear are passed along to the next generation. Our challenge today, if our republic is to survive, is to renew the unifying principles that define us as Americans, that have made us exceptional. We need to rediscover and re-embrace the principles that hold our nation together. Americans can disagree over any number of issues that divide us down the middle. We can be divided when it comes to election outcomes. But if we don't accept certain basic fundamental rules of conduct in the public square and agree on the basic institutional framework of our civil society, our nation is sure to decline. The basic concepts must be taught. Concepts such as the dignity of the individual, personal responsibility and self-reliance, and perhaps most fundamental of all, that we're endowed with inalienable rights from our Creator to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These are the cohesive ideas upon which a free society is built. These are the bedrock principles upon which rest such concepts as a free press, freedom of speech, and religious liberty. They are the source of legal concepts such as due process and innocent until proven guilty. And they form the bedrock of our free enterprise system. So how do we reclaim these ideas that hold our society together? That role falls to each of us, in our families, in our communities, in our churches, but an equally large burden rests on our schools, our K through 12, and our institutions of higher learning. Reform and renewal of our universities is vital. When those who despise America and disparage our nation's founders and founding ideas control our schools, we have little hope of preserving our fragile experiment in liberty. A nation cannot survive if a generation of citizens are brought up to think their country is corrupt at the core, that it operates on principles such as white privilege and exists only to further enhance the wealth of the rich and powerful. Those of you who read the outstanding analysis of the James Martin Center scholars are aware that we have a serious lack of intellectual diversity on the faculties of our colleges and universities. Just this past week, a recent study by Professor Samuel Abrams, who's a scholar at AEI and a professor at Sarah Lawrence University, offers a new warning. not about college professors, but about the professional college administrators. He writes a warning to incoming college students, and I quote, "These collegiate administrators, those who work in such areas as student affairs, diversity and inclusion, and residential life, far outnumber faculty and are gaining significant power on campus in terms of setting the overall tone of the school and in terms of how the material is taught. The scary part," he adds, "is that this group has amassed more power and influence than professors, the ones who actually are trained to teach. Further, college administrators are overwhelmingly politically progressive, to the tune of 13 to 1. He concludes, "The data also show how far administrators are willing to go when spreading their ideology. A whopping 71% of student administrators are far more concerned with teaching current events, multiculturalism, and highlighting social justice questions instead of the teaching of math, science, and technical knowledge. Such a worldview will only turn those of you in the classroom into ignorant, ahistorical activists with few analytical, empirical, and reasoning skills that are the hallmarks of a true liberal education." End of quote of Professor Abrams. So I think that gives us a new warning, and this reinforces the point of Jonathan Haidt from New York University, founder of Heterodox Academy, who argues that the lack of intellectual diversity in colleges and universities has led to a shift in the purpose of many institutions, from the search for truth and transmittal of the best values of our civilization to the promotion of a social justice agenda. The consequences of this are many. One result is a generation or more with abysmal civic and economic literacy. Public opinion polls show robust support for socialism, especially among young people. We see regular evidence of ignorance of our history and of the Constitution. A few data points. A Pew poll found that 40% of millennials think government should be able to take measures to prevent speech that is offensive. A YouGov poll indicates 43% of Americans under the age of 30 have a favorable view of socialism, and only 30% have a favorable view of capitalism. Surveys show that only one-third of Americans can name the 3 branches of government. And of course, many young people think Judge Judy is a justice on the U.S. Supreme Court. I'm told recently of a young reporter delivering the evening news reading a teleprompter who referred to World War XI without any notice of it. Well, enough of the depressing commentary for this evening. Let me shift gears a little. There's a story about a young man who decides to join a monastery that requires monks to take a vow of silence. That vow can only be broken every 5 years when the monk is allowed to speak 2 words. Well, this young man joins the monastery, and after 5 years, the abbot calls him in and said, "All right, you can say 2 words." And the young monk says, "Bed hard." And the abbot says, "All right, go back to your meditation." So another 5 years pass, he's called in again, and the abbot says, "All right, what do you have to say?" He said, "Food awful." He goes back and meditates for 5 years, comes back in and says to the abbot, "I quit." The abbot says, "I'm not surprised. All you've done since you got here is complain." Well, I've offered enough complaints tonight about where we are, so let me suggest some things to improve the situation and where I see bright spots on the horizon. First and foremost, we need to be more informed and careful donors to our alma maters and to higher education generally. I know you've read work of the Martin Center on this topic and other organizations that encourage us to do this. And it's very hard as alums who love our alma mater. But before giving, I suggest we ask some simple questions to the development person who calls to ask for our gift. Some of those questions are things like, can you provide me with evidence that shows what students are learning at this institution? Probably most can't give you much. Can you offer evidence that you have intellectual diversity on your faculty? And there are resources that you can find to check out whether what they tell you is true. What are your policies regarding free speech? Fortunately, a growing number of schools, I don't know, maybe 40, George Leath could probably tell me how many have adopted the University of Chicago principles on free speech, and many of those are living by them and inculcating those in the students there. I was with Mitch Daniels of Purdue last week, who's the trustee emeritus at my organization, and they're doing great things at Purdue in that regard to make sure that students are safe for ideas and that ideas don't have to be made safe for the students. Another piece of advice along the same lines of giving wisely is to put restrictions on your gift to ensure your philanthropic vision is met. Better yet, you can seek alternatives that accomplish your vision, the James Martin Center being one very good alternative. And this is also self-serving advice but I consider good advice nonetheless, is to support your university through an independent organization. There is what I call the alternative university that exists. For example, many donors who support the Fund for American Studies give us funding of scholarships so we can recruit students from their alma mater to come to our programs. We have one donor who just this week here in North Carolina put a stipulation on his gift to the university that any recipients of his scholarships have to be required to attend a summer program sponsored by the Fund for American Studies in Washington, D.C. And they agreed to those terms. Many donors give to outside organizations to fund lectures at their universities and debates. There's a strong network of organizations that are part of this alternative university. There are groups such as the Institute for Humane Studies, the Leadership Institute, ISI, Young Americans for Freedom, Young Americans for Liberty, Students for Liberty, FEE, the Network of Enlightened Women, the Federalist Society, the Clare Boothe Luce Institute, the American Enterprise Institute, Values and Capitalism Project, and many, many more. These are great organizations that can help expose students at universities to ideas they might not be hearing in the classroom. I also challenge all of you to follow the advice that we heard a lot of after 9/11. If you go to an airport, you hear the announcements. If you see something, say something. And I add to that, if you hear something, say something. I think it's important for those of us who believe in American values to speak up, to let our opinions be heard, and to respond when we hear comments that we don't agree with, that we think are ill-informed. This is especially true when your children or your grandchildren return home for Thanksgiving in a few weeks from college, and they start asking you at the Thanksgiving table about your white privilege or about your views on politics. I can't tell you the number of donors I go see who tell me how upset they are. I have a donor who worked for 20 years for John Bolton, and she sent her son to the University of Colorado in 2016 and called her just on election night to say he was voting, I guess it was primary time, because she told him he was voting for Bernie Sanders. And she was really upset and wanted us to start a re-education camp. And I hear from enough donors who express this concern about their sons and daughters going to college and having their views turned 180, who are looking for help through programs we run. But I think it's important for all of us to, in a well-mannered way, challenge the ideas of people we don't agree with. They're great. You can excel at this if you do it thoughtfully, I think. One example I like is someone coming up to you, a good friend perhaps, and saying, I think we need a single-payer national health insurance program in our country. Rather than just take them on, you can ask them, well, why do you think that? And then they might give you a reason, and you can show empathy. Well, my son is going to lose his insurance if he can't be on mine. And you can say, I think it's terrible that your son's not going to have insurance. And then address it, in a way that shows that a single-payer plan is going to be worse, and you can point to examples. But my larger point is just it's important that that those of us who share a worldview that's for limited government be willing to speak up and not be intimidated to express our views. And we often all get into situations where we feel intimidated, just as conservative students often do on campus in the classroom. We had a young woman this summer attend our program, and she came to us because my sister, who lives in Ann Arbor, Michigan, saw a piece in the school newspaper written by this young woman, Talia Katz, saying how she felt intimidated at University of Michigan expressing her views in class and to her classmates, and how stifling this environment was. And a few weeks later, they published another article by another student saying that that she was a friend of Talia, and Talia was a bigot and a racist and just a terrible person. And Talia had never met this girl. It was a totally fabricated story attacking her. And when my sister sent me this article about it, I said to our staff, recruit Talia to our program, and she came this summer. And she just published a piece in the New York Daily News about her experience at Michigan. But I feel for these students who are feeling intimidated on campus. I have a board member from Dallas who attended Berkeley, and he just wrote Berkeley a letter and said, I went to Berkeley 25 years ago as a conservative, and I was constantly met with liberal professors. And I thank you for that. He said it helped me learn to defend my beliefs, it strengthened my principles, but you aren't giving that opportunity to the liberal students at Berkeley, so I'm not going to support you anymore. Because liberals don't have the opportunity I had to be challenged in their beliefs, and I thought that was a great approach for you to take. Well, if we're going to reverse the trends in our culture today, we must present a compelling case for a free society. Much wisdom comes from George Schultz through his iconic comic strip, Charlie Brown. I recall one that he wrote in which Charlie asks his always philosophical friend Linus, the guy who carried that security blanket everywhere, Linus, suppose that nobody liked you or listened to what you were saying. What would you do? What would be your answer? To that, Linus replies, I would examine myself very carefully to discover where my weaknesses lie, and then I would attempt to correct them. That is my answer, Charlie Brown. To this, Charlie Brown says, I hate that answer. Well, many of us do need to, I think all of us need to change our approach and challenge our approach and see where our weaknesses lie and try to build the case for a free society. We believe men and women who are free can accomplish remarkable things when they're left free, and that's the case we have to make. Those of us who believe in persuasion over force in human relationships must present our case in such a way that we will attract others to it. One of the primary aims of the Fund for American Studies and the Foundation for Teaching Economics, which is our high school affiliate, is to do just that, to teach economics in the economic way of thinking in a compelling way. At the high school level, we do this through Economics for Leaders camps in the summer, where students, they sit in class in the morning learning economics, but are constantly up out of their seats, participating in all sorts of activities to learn important economic concepts. They engage in trading games where they actually trade things with each other to learn about trade and comparative advantage. They learn about property rights and environmental stewardship through games and activities. And we do that for a week, and in the afternoon they're outside doing leadership activities. And the students leave just having a great experience, telling us it was the best week of their life up to then, and they've taken away very important principles of economics and learning how our free enterprise system operates. At our college programs at the Fund for American Studies, we take a little bit different approach. I must mention that our programs are attended by a cross-section of students. They come interested in politics, public policy, international relations, journalism, and related fields. They're passionate about what's going on in Washington, D.C., and that's what draws them to us. They come for internships that we offer them. They come from colleges both large and small. The top schools represented in the past few years were UNC, Purdue, the U.S. Air Force Academy, Clemson, Penn State, University of Virginia, Arizona State, and Texas Christian. Students come from across the political spectrum: left, right, center, libertarian, undecided, and confused. And they arrive with a sincere desire to change the world. They see poverty and injustice around them, and they want to take action. Many look at government as the vehicle to solve very real problems that they see around them. So we have a multi-step process to address this in our programs. Step one, which is somewhat of a newer addition to our program, is an orientation session with a heavy focus on free speech. We've worked with FIRE, Robert Shipley's group, in creating this program. But we found that many students came to us no longer believing in free speech, no longer thinking that they should be confronted with ideas they disagree with. So at orientation, we bring in speakers to talk about the tremendous value you have through intellectual diversity, through being challenged to defend your views, from hearing views you might not agree with. And it's been very effective at opening students up to talk openly, to defend their ideas, and to learn. By the time the students sit down in their first class a few days later, they're in the right frame of mind to engage in an intellectual adventure with our professors. Step two comes from our requirement that all students take a course in economics. For many, especially journalism students, they've never had economics. Rather, when he was still on CBS News, saying in a radio interview that the one course he wished he'd taken in college was economics, because he didn't understand economics, and economics involves every single issue they cover on the news every night. So we feel that it's vital that anyone going into leadership learn some economics. We also, in that approach to economics, teach it under the influence of Paul Hain, who was very involved in the Foundation for Teaching Economics with us, that you should teach the first course in economics not like it's the first course a student is going to take on his way to a PhD many years later, but it's likely the only course in economics they're going to take. Professors have the opportunity in Economics 101 to teach students about our free enterprise system, about the superiority of free markets, and about the tremendous things we enjoy because of free markets. I reflect on my own experience with my own three daughters. One went to Davidson, two went to the University of Virginia. The one requirement I gave them all before I signed the tuition checks was you have to take a course in economics. But I still found that they take Economics 101, Psychology 101, Sociology 101, a whole range of courses. Psychology and sociology turn them on to those subjects as majors. Economics, unfortunately, as it was taught in their classes, was boring. And I think we need to reform the economics profession so that first course in economics is not trying to accomplish getting across things students need to become PhDs. So we teach it that way. We make it exciting. The only thing I regret about it is when our students do the high school programs, they get so excited at economics, when they go off to college, they decide they want to major in it. They take that first course and they're bored to death. Step three for us is, in some sense, to disabuse students from the idea that they know everything. So many students come to us thinking, they're ready to change the world and they know everything they need to know, and why are they taking economics? One of our professors has developed a great quiz she gives the students on the first day. She passes out this quiz with questions that you can find, answers to on Google probably. And they fill this out. It's questions like, has poverty in the world been getting better or getting worse? What percentage of $1 in revenue does a business take in profits? How many people work for the minimum wage? And she'll collect these answers, these basic questions, they turn them in, they think they're being graded on the first day of class. And she says, don't worry, I'm not going to grade you, but let's look at some of the answers. And she starts reading. And students are saying, see, the percentage of profit on $1 of sales is probably 80 cents. She's saying, well, if you believe that, you should quit school today and start a business. You'll be rich. Most students think poverty is increasing in the world. They don't know that 2 billion people have been lifted out of poverty since 1990. And according to the World Bank, their definition of poverty, nobody will be in poverty in 15 years. I heard John Mackey, the founder of Whole Foods, this summer spoke to our students and he said to them, if you want to see poverty in 15 or 20 years, you're going to have to go to the museum to see it. You know, they were shocked. They were outraged you would say that, because that can't be true. Poverty is getting worse. But, you know, we tell students you can look it up, and they do, and they find out, you know, it's being alleviated. It's disappearing thanks to markets. So they're very, you know, their heads are down at the end of taking this quiz, and the professor says, well, you are going to be graded on it, but don't think you know everything. We also try to disabuse students of the answer that they can solve problems just by turning to government. And that's where the work of our professors comes in, of giving students the tools of economics. And we think through the tools of economics, if you know how to use them, you can address public policy problems in a much more rational, reasonable way. We say, take off your political hat, put on your policy hat when you're with us, and don't look at things from a political, you know, what's going to get us ahead, but let's look at how to solve these problems. So we convey, I'm not going to go into the details, but we convey a lot of the basic economic concepts from supply and demand, opportunity costs, free trade, how the role of prices, etc. I like to use stories to reach young people about the power of our free enterprise system. And two of my favorites in conveying this are just the great strides we've made as we become richer, wealthier, healthier than 2 centuries ago. I read in the Wall Street Journal about 6 months ago a book review about Henry David Thoreau. And in this review, it mentioned the very close relationship that Henry David Thoreau had with his brother John. They did everything together, canoeing the rivers of Massachusetts and New Hampshire, and exploring the outdoors. And then one day, when I think John Thoreau was only about 19 or 20, he was shaving, and he cut his finger with a razor blade, and a few weeks later he died of lockjaw. And then fast forward about 100 years, 80 years, you may have heard the story of Calvin Coolidge, President of the United States, living in the White House. And his son, 16-year-old son, goes out to play tennis on the White House tennis court with his brother. He develops a blister on his toe, and within days dies of a staph infection at Walter Reed Army Hospital. The President of the United States' son, access to the best healthcare available at that time, dies of a staph infection. Things that today we don't worry about at all. We get a blister or cut our finger. It's thanks to the free enterprise system that we don't worry about those things. And then I share the story of my niece, Megan. On July 20th in 1995, my organization celebrated its 25th anniversary. We had a great gala at the Library of Congress, black tie, Colin Powell spoke, we had students give testimonials. It was a wonderful evening. My wife and I came home and I nodded off to sleep, and all of a sudden I'm jolted awake by the telephone ringing. It's my father, choking through tears, telling me that my 16-year-old niece, Megan, had died of a heart attack. And we had known she had a heart defect that her sister also has. And, you know, it was a tragedy. It struck. She had seen the doctor only weeks before, I think a month before. But I often wonder, you know, could we have been further along in technology at that point that Megan could have lived? Her sister, who was 8 years younger at the time, with the same heart defect, not long, maybe within 10 years, had an implanted defibrillator that she's now close to 40, has 3 kids, beautiful kids, lives in Ann Arbor, and I say, if we hadn't imposed the kind of tax burden draining resources out of our economy, wasting them, regulating entrepreneurs and innovators, could these things have come along earlier to save the lives of so many people in our society? How would our lives be different? So I tell these just as ways to convey the power of our free enterprise system. This year, Rich DeVos, one of the founders of Amway, died, and I heard him give a speech 35 years ago that stuck with me. And he talked in his speech about how, thanks to free markets, that literally the deaf can hear, the blind can see, and the lame can walk. And I didn't think, I wondered if that was true at the time, but now I myself know people who, thanks to cochlear implants, have had their hearing restored for the first time in their lives. Thanks to cataract and other surgeries, blind people who would be blind can see. We're eliminating diseases that cause blindness. And thanks to everything from hip and knee implants to other transplants, replacements, knee and hip replacements, the lame can walk in many instances. It's remarkable, the power of markets, and it's so easy. There's so many examples to convey this to our students. There's a writer for Forbes, John Tamney, who speaks regularly for us, and he talks to young people, and he says, to the young people in the audience, he said, if you want to know what the world will be like in 20 years, I can tell you, you are going to be so fortunate. In 20 years, your lives are going to be so much better than ours are today. And then he explains how he can tell them what it's like, how he knows that in 20 years, they will only fly on private jets when they go places. In 20 years, the marvelous things that happen, he said, just go back to 1900, pick a year, 1920, 1940, 1960. He said, if you want to know what it'll be like 20 years from now, just go and look at how the richest people in our society live. That's how you'll be living. Because that has been the case every 20 years this century. In 1910, 1920, only the richest people owned a car. In 1940, 1950, only the richest people had TVs and color TVs and washers and dryers. And there was a time where only the richest people had the cell phone. It was this big clunky thing with the antenna on it. And within 20 years or less, we all have these cell phones in our pockets, and they're so much more powerful and so much more cheaper than they were 20 years ago when only the rich could afford them. So the trend under freedom and free markets is for the rich people get in front of the line, they buy the product first, it's the worst version, it costs the most, and very rapidly, it used to be a 20-year cycle or a 30-year cycle, now it's a matter of months often, that product is available to 90% of people at a much lower price, at a much superior quality. And that's the free market, and that's why young people today have a great future in store for them, as long as we maintain our freedom in this country and our free market economy. I was mentored to some degree by a gentleman by the name of Leonard Reed. He was the founder of the Foundation for Economic Education in 1946, and I had the opportunity to go work for him for 3 years early in my career. And he knew that if you believe in liberty, you must focus on education. He kind of said, politics doesn't, it's a reflection of education. It matters, but it's a reflection of education. If we want to change the world, if we want to maintain our freedom, it's education that's the key. Because politics is a reflection of what people are taught and what they learn. And so despite dabbling in politics myself, early in my career, I came to the realization that I devote my energies to education. And I admire all of you here who support the Martin Center for devoting your precious resources to the work of higher education, to the work of Jenna Robinson and her team at the Martin Center. I think it's so valuable. I'm confident that the work they do, the work that we all do, is really making a difference. Jen and I were talking about a recent meeting of something called the State Policy Network in Salt Lake City. Corey, I know, goes there. I think Clarice Smith was there from the John William Pope Foundation, a great foundation that supports our work, and we're grateful for that. I just have the greatest admiration for Art Pope. But the State Policy Network had over 1,000 people from state think tanks around the country. All 50 states were represented. There were a lot of groups from DC, over 1,000 people, and most were in their 20s and 30s. I felt like an old guy there being there with David Stover, who some of you know, who is an old guy.
Looks young to me.
David Stover serves on my board. He attended a Fund for American Studies program 1 year after me, so I'm older than him. But to go to something like the State Policy Network and see 1,000 young people who believe in free markets, trying to figure out ways to promote private solutions to problems is really inspiring. About that same time, the Mont Pelerin Society, an international organization of economists and academics, was meeting with hundreds and hundreds of people from around the world. In November, the Atlas Network is going to be holding a meeting in New York of people coming from around the world, probably 1,000 of them, to come talk about how to advance the cause of liberty and the ideas of liberty around the world. There are the BB&T chairs that the BB&T Bank has established at colleges and universities, the Charles Koch Foundation, academic centers. All these things leave me a lot of hope and encouragement that we can turn this thing around and protect our values, that we can reignite a strong understanding of American history, and that our children and our grandchildren, of which I have two, will be able to enjoy the freedom that earlier generations of Americans enjoyed as well. So thank you very much. I'm told we have time for a few questions if there are any. I'd be happy to respond to them and hear from you as well if you have anything you want to say. Yes, sir.
It's always been a puzzle to me that board members of a college have been so silent over the years as this transformation has occurred, and yet they have so much power, and yet they don't seem to really understand the dynamics of how college works or understand the transformation that's occurring. They're silent about everything.
Yeah, I wrote a letter. It was a fundraising letter a few years ago, probably 5 or 6 years ago. And I cited statistics, probably pulling them from Martin Center studies about professors being 13 to 1, 14 to 1, Democrat to Republican, or liberal to conservative in so many of the departments. And I sent it, and I went a few weeks later to see a donor in New York, John Whitehead. He was a managing director of Goldman Sachs, very prominent citizen in New York. He was Undersecretary of State under George Shultz in the Ronald Reagan administration. I think he chaired the rebuilding after the 9/11 attacks at the World Trade Center. But he was nearing 90, I think, at the time, but he was on the board of Haverford College in Pennsylvania. And he told me he got my letter, put it in his pocket, took it to a board meeting at Haverford College. And they spent an hour or more talking about the need for more diversity in their student body. And they were talking about racial diversity. But when they finished this 2-hour presentation with deans and administrators, and the meeting was about to adjourn, he said he pulled out the letter and he said, I wanted to ask a question about a different type of diversity. I wanted to ask about intellectual diversity. And he said he quoted the statistics in my letter. And the president said to the deans there, and John Whitehead said, how many Republicans do we have on the faculty? And the president asked the dean, and the few professors huddled, and they said, we can think of 5 or 6. And John Whitehead said it led then to a very animated discussion by the trustees, mostly people from the business world, who thought, we need more intellectual diversity. We need, it shouldn't be necessarily party affiliation, but we need more, some Republicans in the political science department might be a plus. And he said, and then they adjourned, and he said it was his last board meeting, so he doesn't know if anything would ever come of it. But sometimes just asking questions, if trustees would ask questions, I think they'll find allies on the board who would back them up and be supportive of what they have to say. I sat next to, when I was with Mitch Daniels last week, I was also with the chairman of the board of Purdue. And it's clear that a strong president like Mitch Daniels is important, but he needs a chairman who will back him up and align the board with what he's trying to accomplish there, because the faculty's 100% against him. Particularly, he said, the American Studies faculty, going after him all the time with what he's trying to do. But I don't know. Jane Shaw, I know, she and I have talked about this problem a lot. And I have several people on my board and some of my donors who serve on university boards. And what they're told usually is that's not the job of the board. The faculty runs the faculty. It's not the considered board what the courses are. That's a violation of academic freedom. But one other example, I have a donor who's on the board of Bethany College in West Virginia. I don't think he'd mind me saying this, but they're having financial trouble. So he went to the board meeting and said, I know how we can turn this school around. Let's become another Hillsdale College. Because there are enough conservative kids out there looking for a college like Hillsdale. But he couldn't get any traction, and the president and the faculty, of course, were against it. But he probably had a way to save a school by offering courses in the liberal arts, on the American founding, and having a little more of a conservative bent to it. There's a market for that. I think Hillsdale is flourishing, and other schools that are struggling could flourish if they adopted that model. Yes, sir.
Thank you for your comments tonight. It was a fascinating survey of kind of the state of academia today. I'm curious about your thoughts, and I don't know if you know sources for this, but do you see a need for financial backing for conservative scholarship? I mean, my sense is that there are deep pockets for liberal and identity politics and social justice oriented scholarship, but there's not nearly as developed a network of financial support for people who are trying to go into conservative scholarship and really become the professors that you've been describing aren't presently there. Do you see a need for that kind of thing to exist, or does it currently exist, or what are your thoughts on that issue?
Well, it does exist. I don't know a lot about that area, but there was one great foundation that funded a lot of that work that has gone out of business. They decided to spend out the Earhart Foundation, which used to give money to professors that they could pass on to graduate students and would fund research and projects like that. They were in Michigan. There are some foundations that still direct money to professors and then give it out to deserving graduate students. I'm sure that, there are some associations, academic associations, that provide opportunities in different disciplines, but no doubt there's a need for more of that. I'm trying to think of what entities really lead the way in that regard. I think some of what the Charles Koch Foundation does through their centers provides money in certain ways to help with that. But you got to be careful again, because if you're a grad student, you take money from the Charles Koch Foundation. It's like it may make it difficult for you to be hired. I'd say the best place to maybe start, if you were looking for it, would be the Institute for Humane Studies, which focuses very much on graduate students and graduate study and trying to help students get into the tenure track position at a university. And they're near us. They're in Arlington, Virginia. Over here.
I just wanted to comment on that comment about the boards, the university boards, because I'm on the university board. And we are not allowed to pick faculty. And in fact, there are rules in place, which I did not realize years before I was on the board, that prevent us from having an impact on viewpoint diversity. And that is this concept of academic freedom, that the faculty does select the professors. And what I think the public has not realized is that now we have an institution, i.e. the faculty, which has discriminated against people who disagree with them politically. And now, you can't look at a conservative board and say, well, that's going to be the solution. I think really the solution is, well, first, I think tenure is a problem because that ensconces people in the university. They don't have to respond to any demands of the board or administration even on viewpoint diversity. And the best suggestion I've ever heard is that donors and people who give to the university, partner with the university, start demanding viewpoint diversity just like people in the workplace are demanding racial and gender diversity. So I don't think conservative boards are really in the place to make that change given this structure of academic freedom and the accreditation rules that prevent university boards from having an impact on viewpoint diversity.
Yeah, can I ask, are you on the board of a private or a public university?
Public.
Yeah, because a private university I think will be different than a public in terms of the board exercising more control over the faculty if need be. But you're right, it's somewhat ironic that the kind of the origins of tenure were to protect the professor who might be expressing a viewpoint that was outside the mainstream. And now they're almost all in lockstep with each other. One approach that I think, I don't know if it's started in full or has much traction, would be there have been some places where conservative students have tried to take over the student government and agitate through student government, like petition the board to have intellectual diversity on the campus. That would probably be a more effective approach in the situation. I know some states have passed legislation protecting free speech in the public universities in the state. I'm not sure that's the best approach, but I don't know if you've done that in North Carolina.
So I'll just kind of give you an example.
Yeah.
I mean, I've had professors at UNC Law School tell me just privately, in order to get hired at UNC Law School, you have to go through interviews with almost everybody on the tenured faculty.
Yeah.
And they will tell you, they're never going to let a conservative in.
Yeah.
And I can't control that.
Yes, sir.
I read Buckley's God and Man at Yale recently, and I was just struck by two things. One, how accurately he saw in 1950 as whatever he was, 21-year-old, what was going on in American education. And then the other thing was that his prescription for that was donors should cut off the money and stop funding universities that are undermining, what they really believe in. And if you look back over the last 60 or 70 years since he wrote that, he was more accurate than probably he even knew on the direction, but the amount of money that donors who've made their money in the free market, the amount of money that's poured into universities is just beyond anything he probably imagined in 1950. Do you see any evidence that donors are standing up and saying, wait a minute, we're just not going to fund this anymore?
No, I don't.
I'm afraid that might be the answer.
There are donors who are finding ways to, be thoughtful and structure their gifts in a way that they do some good. That's a challenge, but it works particularly easier at a private school perhaps than a public, but it's a challenge. Donors gave money to George Mason University and renamed the law school the Antonin Scalia Law School, and it already has a faculty that's very kind of law and economics, libertarian, constitutionalist. But it's a state university, so it's remarkable. They took a lot of heat, and the president stood strong, and they built a strong free market economics department, and that's because, they had presidents who may not have been center-right, but who appreciated what this was doing for growing the university. And so they supported it and defended it when it was attacked. But I don't know that money going to universities is being diminished at any extent by donors deciding they don't want to fund it. I'm sure there is an impact, but I don't know if it's noticeable to the university administrations. I was talking to Jen at dinner since my daughter went to Davidson, and she said there, well, I know of the fact that, like my daughter, another parent whose daughter went there, we're unhappy that Davidson didn't have a little more diversity in the faculty and the speakers are coming. And there's someone I know who works for the president who's called me and said she would like to bring in some more conservative speakers to campus, and I helped him get Jonah Goldberg to go down there, and I think they brought David Brooks from the New York Times without my help, but she's feeling the pressure enough, I guess, that he said she wants, or maybe she just genuinely wants to see that there's more diversity, so she brought some conservative speakers to campus.
Parents or grandparents can direct their child to not go to that university. You don't have to actually go there. You can get some online education. It's not until you need the really technical definition of some of the higher level learning that some of these schools are starting to struggle as well.
Oh yeah, I think the model is probably, the higher ed model in some cases is obsolete, and there is a lot that, there's been an establishment in Washington, the Department of Education, the accreditation agencies that have attempted to lock it in and slow down this online courses, but they are having trouble with that. And Purdue they bought Kaplan, and they've set up a whole new division I think that's probably more of the solution. It's the technology is overtaking this. More and more companies, I think, who increasingly think that sometimes when they hire that they don't need to have someone with a BA.
They're looking more for apprenticeships.
Yeah. I mean, I know some accounting firms in England. I remember reading this was a few years ago, said, we find it's better if we hire some young person who's just out of high school, teach them accounting, because then they don't know all the bad habits they pick up in college, just sitting around all day drinking beer and going to class for an hour. So I think that there's hope in that, and that's a good hopeful point, I think, to conclude the evening. So thank you for that. Thank you all very much.
Thank you all for coming. If you enjoyed what you heard tonight, please take some time to go to our website later this week, and in the coming weeks we'll have a transcript of Roger's speech. We'll have the video up online coming up in the next few days. Please share our work with your friends and others who you think are interested. Take time to come back to our website and find out more of what we're doing. Again, thank you very much, and I hope you all have a wonderful evening.